Dad disowned us after he found a new wife. Now he is trying to restore the relationship with us after his wife cheated on him. So, this whole thing started when I was 19 and my sister was 17. Our mom walked out on us for some guy she met at work. She just packed her stuff one day and left. No warning, no explanation, just gone. Dad was still around, but he wasn't exactly stepping up. He had a job, sure, but he wasn't interested in taking care of us. I'd asked him for help with bills or groceries, and he'd shrug it off most of the time. He tossed me a few bucks here and there, but it was never consistent. My sister got it even worse. He flat out told her she should find a rich husband like Mom did. He said he didn't see the point in providing for her anymore since she was old enough to figure it out. We were all still living in the same house back then, this old 3-bedroom place we'd had since I was a kid. Dad owned it outright, no mortgage or anything, which was the only reason we weren't on the street. But he was barely there. He'd come home from work, eat whatever we had in the fridge, then head out again. Sometimes he wouldn't show up for days. I don't know where he went, probably crashing with friends or something. Point is, he left us to fend for ourselves way before he officially ditched us. My sister and I were basically roommates in a house that still had his name on it, trying to keep the lights on while he did whatever he wanted. I just started community college, taking a couple classes while working part-time at a gas station. My sister was still in high school, but she had to pick up shifts at a fast food place after school just to eat. Dad's money came randomly, $1.50 one week, nothing for a month after that. He never sent anything to my sister though. He kept saying she needed to learn how to survive, and that a husband would fix her problems. It was messed up, but that's how he thought. We didn't have time to argue with him about it. We were too busy trying to pay for food and the electric bill. That's how things were for about 2 years. Me and my sister scraping by, Dad showing up every now and then like he still lived there, acting like nothing was wrong. I hated him for it, but I didn't know what else to do. We were stuck. Then he met this woman, and everything changed again. So, after 2 years of this half-assed living situation, Dad met someone new. Her name was Cheryl. I only met her once before he took off, but she seemed okay at first, just this middle-aged woman with bleached blonde hair and a loud laugh. She worked as a bartender at some dive bar Dad started hanging out at. He'd been spending more and more time away from the house anyway, but once Cheryl came into the picture, he pretty much stopped coming home altogether. It wasn't a gradual thing either. One day he just showed up, grabbed a bunch of his clothes and his old TV from the living room, and said he was moving in with her. He didn't ask me or my sister what we thought about it. He didn't even tell us he was leaving for good until he was already halfway out the door. I remember him saying something about how Cheryl had her own place and he was starting fresh. That was it. No discussion, no plan for us, just him bailing. The house was still in his name, so technically we could stay, but he wasn't paying the property taxes or utilities anymore. He left that all on us. I was 21 by then, still juggling college and my gas station job, and my sister was 19, working full-time at the fast food place after graduating high school. We had to figure it out on our own. Every once in a while, he'd send me some cash, $100 or so, usually in an envelope with no note. Never anything for my sister though. He stuck to his line about her needing to find a husband. I'd call him sometimes, asking for more help, but he'd just say he was busy or that Cheryl didn't like him, wasting money on us. It was clear he'd checked out completely. He had his new life with his new woman, and we were just leftovers he didn't want to deal with. Cheryl's place was about 20 minutes away, some rundown apartment complex on the edge of town. I drove by it once out of curiosity, but I never went inside. Dad didn't invite us over, and I wasn't about to beg. My sister and I were too busy keeping the house running, paying the electric bill, fixing leaks, buying cheap groceries. We were pissed, but we didn't have the energy to chase him down. He'd made his choice, and we were stuck cleaning up the mess. With Dad gone, living with Cheryl, my sister and I had to get serious about keeping the house going. I was still at the gas station, pulling night shifts after classes, making just enough to cover my half of the bills. My sister was at the fast food joint, working her way up to shift supervisor, which gave her a small pay bump. We split everything, electricity, water, internet, whatever came up. The house was old, so stuff broke all the time. The water heater went out once, and we had to scrape together $300 to fix it. Another time, the kitchen sink clogged, and we spent a whole weekend trying to unclog it ourselves because we couldn't afford a plumber. Dad's random cash drops kept coming, but they were unpredictable. Sometimes I'd get $50 in the mail, sometimes $200, but it was never enough to rely on. My sister never saw a dime, which pissed her off more than it did me. She'd rant about how Dad still thought she was supposed to magically find some rich guy to take care of her. She didn't want that, she wanted to stand on her own, same as me. We both knew we couldn't count on him, so we didn't bother asking anymore. The last time I called, he said Cheryl didn't like him sending money anyway, so I stopped trying. We got into a rhythm though. I'd handle the bigger bills like electricity, and she'd cover groceries and smaller stuff. We ate a lot of ramen and frozen pizzas because it was cheap. I dropped out of college after that semester, couldn't keep up with the workload and the job. My sister talked about going to trade school for something like welding, but we didn't have the money to make it happen yet. The house was ours to live in, but it felt like a burden. Property taxes were due every year, and we had to scramble to pay them so we wouldn't lose it. Dad's name was still on the deed, but he didn't care about that part. It wasn't easy, but we managed. We didn't talk about Dad much, just kept our heads down and worked. He'd been gone for about a year by then, living his new life with Cheryl, and we were fine without him. Or at least we thought we were. Then he showed up again, and everything got complicated. It was a random Tuesday night when Dad showed up again. I was in the kitchen heating up some leftovers, and my sister was in the living room scrolling on her phone. The doorbell rang, which was weird because no one ever came by that late. I opened the door, and there he was, looking rough. His hair was grayer than I remembered, and he had this beat-up duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He didn't say much at first, just asked if he could come in. I let him, mostly out of shock. He sat on the couch and started talking. Cheryl had kicked him out. Apparently, she got tired of him sitting around her apartment all day, not doing anything while she worked. He admitted he'd been on her case a lot, telling her what she should be doing, how she should keep the place clean, stuff like that. She finally snapped, cheated on him with some guy from the bar, and told him to get lost. He didn't have anywhere else to go, so he came back to the house. His house, technically, since his name was still on it. He looked at me and my sister, and said he was sorry. He said he'd messed up, that he shouldn't have left us like he did. He talked about how he'd been a bad father, and wanted to make things right. I didn't buy it, not right away. My sister didn't either, she just sat there, arms crossed, staring at him. He went on about how he had nowhere else to stay and asked if he could crash with us for a while. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to tell him to leave, but the house was still his, and we couldn't exactly kick him out. So he stayed. That first night, he slept on the couch with his duffel bag next to him. He didn't have much, just some clothes and a couple old books. He said he'd left most of his stuff at Cheryl's and didn't want to go back for it. My sister and I talked about it later, after he passed out. We didn't trust him. He ditched us once already, and now he was back because his new life fell apart. It didn't feel like he cared about us, it felt like he was just out of options. Dad being back in the house changed everything. The next morning, he was still on the couch when I got up for work. He didn't say much, just nodded at me as I grabbed my keys. My sister left for her shift too, and we didn't talk to him before heading out. When we got home that night, he was still there, watching TV with a bag of chips from our pantry. It irritated me, he hadn't asked, just helped himself. That's when I decided we needed to lay down some rules if he was sticking around. I told him straight up that he couldn't just live here like nothing had happened. My sister backed me up. We said he had to pitch in, pay part of the bills, help with groceries, do something useful. He nodded and said he'd try, that he'd get a job soon and start contributing. He didn't have one at the time, apparently, he'd quit his old gig when he moved in with Cheryl, thinking she'd take care of him. Now he was broke, and we weren't about to let him mooch off us like he did before. I also brought up the house itself. It was still in his name, and that bothered me. He'd left us to handle everything, taxes, repairs, all of it, while he was off with Cheryl. Now he was back, acting like he owned the place again. I told him I wanted the deed signed over to me and my sister. It was only fair after he'd abandoned us. He got quiet when I said that, didn't argue, but didn't agree either. He just said he'd think about it. That wasn't good enough for me, but I didn't push it right then. For the next few days he stayed out of our way. He slept on the couch, ate whatever we left out, and started looking for work online using my sister's old laptop. He didn't have much luck though, said no one wanted to hire a guy his age with gaps in his resume. My sister and I kept working our jobs, paying the bills like always. Dad being there didn't make things easier, it just added tension. We weren't ready to forgive him, and he wasn't doing much to earn it. Dad stayed on the couch for a couple weeks. He got a part-time job at a hardware store, just a few shifts a week. He gave us some money for groceries, $60 once, $40 another time, but it wasn't consistent. My sister and I kept paying the main bills ourselves. He didn't help with chores either. He'd leave dishes in the sink or trash on the coffee table. It started getting on our nerves. We'd come home from work, and he'd be there, watching TV or napping, like he wasn't part of the problem. I brought up the house deed again. I told him we needed it in our names. He'd left us to handle it for years, and now he was back using it like a free hotel. He said he wasn't ready to sign it over yet, that he needed security, since Cheryl had screwed him over. That pissed me off. He hadn't cared about our security when he ditched us. My sister agreed, and we started arguing with him more. He'd get defensive, saying he was trying to fix things, but we didn't see much effort. One night, he came home late from a shift and ate the last of my sister's leftovers without asking. She lost it, yelled at him about how he didn't respect us or the house. He yelled back, saying it was still his place and we should be grateful he let us stay. That set me off too. I told him he'd abandoned us, and now he was acting like he'd done us a favor. The fight went on for an hour, and he stormed off to the couch. We didn't talk to him the next day. The tension kept growing. He'd complain about how we treated him, and we'd snap back about how he treated us. He was contributing a little, but it didn't feel like enough. My sister and I started talking about how to force the deed issue, maybe get a lawyer or something. We weren't letting him off easy this time. Things with Dad got worse over the next month. His job at the hardware store didn't last. He got fired for showing up late too many times. He stopped giving us money after that, saying he had none to spare. My sister and I were still working full-time, covering everything while he sat around the house. He'd eat our food, use our stuff, and leave messes. We'd argue almost every day. He'd say he was trying to find work, but we didn't see him doing much about it. I pushed the deed issue harder. I told him he had to sign the house over to us or leave. He refused again, saying it was his only asset and he wasn't giving it up. My sister backed me up. We'd paid the taxes and kept the place running for years while he was gone. He didn't have a leg to stand on, but he wouldn't budge. One night, it turned into a huge fight. He said we were ungrateful, that he'd raised us and this was his house. I told him he'd barely raised us and had no right to claim anything after ditching us for Cheryl. The next day, my sister and I went to a free legal clinic at the library. We asked about forcing him to sign over the deed. The guy there said it'd be tough since his name was on it, but we could try proving abandonment, or something. It'd cost money we didn't have, though. Lawyers aren't cheap. We decided to keep pushing him ourselves instead. When we got home, he was on the couch again, eating our chips. My sister snapped, told him to get out if he wasn't going to help. He didn't leave, just glared at us and said he wasn't going anywhere.